You do not lie to the world first, you lie to yourself. And you do it quietly, without ceremony, without even noticing. Self-deception is not a single act but a structure, a system built over time from small permissions granted to avoid discomfort. You tell yourself what is convenient, not what is true. And slowly, this becomes your reality. The structure of self-deception rests on a simple foundation, the refusal to see things as they are. Instead, you reinterpret, justify, and distort. You protect your ego, your image, your sense of control. But this protection comes at a cost, the loss of clarity. When perception is compromised, judgment follows. And when judgment is compromised, your actions drift further from reason. To understand self-deception is not to condemn yourself, but to uncover the mechanisms that obscure truth, so that you may begin, step by step, to see clearly again. The first distortion, avoidance of discomfort, 650 words. Self-deception does not begin with grand illusions. It begins with something far smaller, almost imperceptible, the quiet avoidance of discomfort. This is the first distortion, the foundational movement upon which the entire structure is built. You are presented with a fact. It is clear, simple, and often inconvenient. It may reveal a weakness, an error in judgment, or a truth that conflicts with how you wish to see yourself. At this precise moment, you are given a choice, to accept the discomfort that accompanies truth, or to move away from it. Most choose the latter, not out of malice, but out of habit. Avoidance rarely feels like avoidance. It disguises itself as reasoning. You tell yourself, it's not that serious, or there are other factors, or anyone would have done the same. These are not outright lies, they are subtle shifts in interpretation. And because they are subtle, they are difficult to detect. This is how self-deception gains its first foothold, not by replacing truth entirely, but by softening it. The mind has a remarkable ability to protect itself. It filters, adjusts, and reframes information in order to maintain internal stability. This capacity is not inherently harmful. In many cases, it allows you to function under pressure. But when it becomes a default response to discomfort, it begins to distort reality. Consider how quickly you defend yourself internally when confronted with criticism. Before fully examining whether the criticism is valid, the mind rushes to construct a defense. It searches for external causes, questions the credibility of the source, or minimizes the issue altogether. This process happens almost instantly, often beneath conscious awareness. What is being protected here is not truth, but identity. You have constructed an image of yourself, competent, rational, just. When reality threatens this image, discomfort arises. And rather than allowing the image to be corrected, you attempt to preserve it. This is the moment where self-deception becomes active. The critical point is this: avoidance is not passive. It is an action. Each time you turn away from an uncomfortable truth, you reinforce a pattern. The mind learns that discomfort is to be escaped, not examined. Over time, this becomes automatic. And with repetition, the structure begins to form. The danger is not in a single act of avoidance, but in its accumulation. Small distortions, repeated consistently, create a framework through which all future experiences are interpreted. You no longer see events as they are, you see them as they must be in order to preserve your internal narrative. At this stage, self-deception is still flexible. It has not yet solidified into a rigid belief system. This is precisely why it is so difficult to detect. It feels natural, even reasonable. You are not yet aware that you are distorting reality, you believe you are interpreting it correctly. But the consequences are already unfolding. When you avoid discomfort, you also avoid correction. Errors go unexamined. Weaknesses remain hidden. Opportunities for growth are missed because they are disguised as threats. You remain within the boundaries of your current understanding, unable to expand beyond it. This is the quiet cost of avoidance, stagnation disguised as stability. It is important to understand that discomfort itself is not the problem. Discomfort is often the signal that something requires attention. It points to gaps in understanding, misalignments in action, or false assumptions that need to be revised. When you avoid discomfort, you are not eliminating the problem, you are eliminating the signal. And without the signal, the problem persists unchecked. The first step in dismantling self-deception, therefore, is not the pursuit of truth, but the willingness to remain with discomfort. To pause, rather than react. To observe, rather than justify. This requires discipline, because it runs counter to instinct. You must learn to recognize the moment of avoidance as it occurs. The slight tension, the immediate urge to explain, to dismiss, to redirect, these are indicators. They mark the threshold between clarity and distortion. If you can remain at that threshold, even briefly, you interrupt the pattern. And in that interruption, something becomes possible, the unfiltered perception of reality. This is where the structure of self-deception begins, and where, with attention and effort, it can also begin to unravel. Rationalization, the architecture of justification. 650 words. Once avoidance has taken place, the mind does not remain idle. It moves quickly to stabilize the distortion it has introduced. This is where rationalization emerges, the second layer in the structure of self-deception. If avoidance is the act of turning away from discomfort, rationalization is the act of explaining why that turn was justified. At this stage, the mind begins to construct narratives. These narratives are not random, they are carefully shaped to preserve coherence. You do not merely ignore the truth, you replace it with something that feels equally valid, but far more comfortable. Rationalization is persuasive because it borrows the language of reason. It presents itself as logic, as fairness, as balanced thinking. You are no longer simply avoiding reality, you are actively defending an alternative version of it. This is what makes rationalization dangerous. It does not feel like deception. It feels like clarity. You begin to gather selective evidence. You recall moments that support your position and quietly discard those that contradict it. You reinterpret events in ways that align with your preferred conclusion. What was once a simple fact becomes a complex story, one in which you are rarely at fault. This process is subtle, but systematic. The mind is not searching for truth, it is searching for consistency with the identity it seeks to preserve. Every justification serves a purpose, to eliminate tension between reality and self-image. And because this tension is uncomfortable, the justifications are readily accepted. Consider how easily responsibility is redistributed. When something goes wrong, the explanation shifts outward. Circumstances were unfavorable. Other people were unreasonable. The timing was wrong. Each of these explanations may contain fragments of truth, but they are arranged in such a way that the central issue remains untouched. You are no longer examining what is accurate, you are constructing what is acceptable. Rationalization operates through amplification and reduction. It amplifies external factors while reducing internal accountability. It magnifies minor uncertainties to cast doubt on clear truths. It reframes failures as misunderstandings, and errors as exceptions. Over time, these patterns form a coherent internal narrative. And once this narrative is established, it becomes increasingly difficult to challenge. New information is filtered through it, interpreted in ways that reinforce its validity. At this point, self-deception begins to stabilize. What started as a moment of avoidance is now supported by a network of justifications. The distortion is no longer fragile, it has structure. And because this structure is built from reasoning, it feels reliable. But there is a fundamental flaw: the reasoning is not directed toward truth, but toward preservation. This distinction is critical. True reasoning seeks alignment with reality, regardless of the outcome. Rationalization, by contrast, seeks alignment with preference. It begins with a conclusion and works backward to justify it. The process appears logical, but its foundation is predetermined. This is why rationalization can persist even in the presence of contradictory evidence. When new facts emerge, They are not integrated, they are reinterpreted, minimized, or dismissed. The structure adapts, not by correcting itself, but by expanding its justifications. The more complex the rationalization becomes, the more convincing it appears. And yet, beneath this complexity, something essential is being lost: direct contact with reality. You are no longer responding to what is, but to what has been constructed. Your decisions, your judgments, your actions, all are influenced by a version of events that has been subtly altered. The consequences of this misalignment may not be immediate, but they are inevitable. Errors compound. Misjudgments accumulate. And because the underlying distortion remains unexamined, the pattern repeats. Breaking this layer of self-deception requires more than recognizing false conclusions. It requires examining the process by which those conclusions were formed. You must begin to question not only what you believe, but how you arrived there. This is a demanding task. It requires intellectual honesty, the willingness to trace your reasoning back to its origin and to identify where preference may have replaced evidence. It requires restraint, the ability to pause before accepting the most convenient explanation. And it requires courage, to accept conclusions that may unsettle your sense of self. Rationalization thrives in speed and certainty. It weakens in reflection and scrutiny. If you slow the process down, if you examine each step rather than accepting the final narrative, you begin to see the inconsistencies. The selective evidence, the shifting standards, the unexamined assumptions, all become visible. And once they are visible, they can no longer operate with the same ease. This is the beginning of structural awareness. You start to recognize that your explanations are not neutral. They are shaped, influenced, directed. And in that recognition, a choice reemerges, the same choice that existed at the beginning, but now at a deeper level. To continue constructing, or to begin dismantling. Rationalization builds the walls of self-deception. But those same walls, once seen clearly, can be taken apart, one justification at a time. Identification, when the false becomes the self. 650 words. As rationalization solidifies the structure of self-deception, a deeper transformation begins to take place, one that is far more difficult to detect and far more resistant to change. This is the stage of identification, where the distortions you have constructed are no longer seen as interpretations, but as reflections of who you are. What began as avoidance, then evolved into justification, now becomes internalized. At this point, your beliefs are no longer external positions that can be examined and adjusted. They are integrated into your identity. To question them is no longer a matter of correcting an error, it feels like a threat to the self. This is the critical shift. You do not simply hold the belief, you become aligned with it. The narrative you have constructed about events, about your actions, about your role in the world, this narrative becomes inseparable from your sense of self. And because identity demands stability, anything that challenges this narrative is met with resistance. This resistance is no longer subtle. Where earlier stages relied on quiet avoidance or careful justification, identification introduces a more rigid defense. Contradictory evidence is not merely reinterpreted, it is rejected outright. Criticism is not evaluated, it is perceived as an attack. Alternative perspectives are not considered, they are dismissed. The structure has hardened. At this level, self-deception operates with a kind of self-sustaining force. The identity reinforces the beliefs, and the beliefs reinforce the identity. Each supports the other, creating a closed system that resists external influence. This is why change becomes so difficult. To dismantle a belief at this stage is to destabilize the identity built upon it. And the mind, prioritizing stability, will do everything it can to prevent this destabilization. It will intensify its defenses, strengthen its justifications, and narrow its perception even further. You may notice this in moments where you feel an immediate, almost visceral rejection of certain ideas. The reaction is disproportionate to the situation. It is not the idea itself that is being resisted, but what the idea implies. If accepted, it would require revision, not just of a single belief, but of the self that holds it. This is where self-deception becomes deeply entrenched. You begin to organize your environment in ways that support your identity. You seek out information that confirms your views. You surround yourself with perspectives that align with your narrative. Over time, this creates an echo chamber in which your beliefs are continuously reinforced. The structure is no longer maintained solely from within, it is supported externally. And within this environment, the illusion of certainty grows stronger. You feel confident, not because your understanding is accurate, but because it is unchallenged. Doubt diminishes, not because questions have been answered, but because they are no longer allowed to surface. The absence of tension is mistaken for clarity. But this clarity is artificial. Beneath it, the original distortions remain. They have not been resolved, they have been concealed, protected by layers of identification and reinforcement. And because they remain unexamined, they continue to shape perception and behavior in ways that are often misaligned with reality. The consequences at this stage are more significant. Decisions are made with increasing confidence but decreasing accuracy. Relationships are strained, as differing perspectives are interpreted as opposition rather than variation. Growth slows, as new information is filtered out before it can be integrated. You are no longer navigating reality, you are defending a version of it. To break through this layer requires a different kind of effort. It is no longer enough to question specific thoughts or explanations. You must begin to separate belief from identity. You must recognize that what you think, even what you strongly believe, is not equivalent to what you are. This distinction creates space. When beliefs are no longer fused with identity, they become examinable again. They can be held, tested, revised, or discarded without threatening the stability of the self. This does not eliminate discomfort, but it changes its nature. Discomfort becomes a signal of adjustment, not a threat of collapse. Achieving this separation is not immediate. It requires repeated acts of awareness. Each time you notice a defensive reaction, you must pause and ask, is this a defense of truth, or a defense of identity? Each time you feel the urge to reject, you must consider, what, exactly, is being protected? These questions begin to loosen the structure. They introduce flexibility where there was rigidity. They allow for the possibility that your current understanding, no matter how convincing, may be incomplete. And in that possibility, the system of self-deception begins to weaken. Identification is the stage where self-deception feels most real. But it is also the point at which awareness, if sustained, can begin to create meaningful change, not by force, but by gradually dissolving the illusion that what you have constructed is inseparable from who you are. Reinforcement, the self-sustaining system. 600 words. Once identification has taken hold, self-deception no longer depends on isolated acts of avoidance or justification. It evolves into a self-sustaining system, one that actively reinforces itself through perception, behavior, and environment. At this stage, the structure is not merely maintained, it is continuously strengthened. Reinforcement operates through repetition. Every time you interpret an event in a way that aligns with your established narrative, the structure becomes more stable. Each confirmation, no matter how small, adds weight to the system. Over time, these confirmations accumulate, creating the impression that your perspective is not only valid, but unquestionably true. This is not because it has been thoroughly tested, but because it has been consistently repeated. The mind begins to anticipate agreement. It no longer approaches situations with openness, but with expectation. You see what you are prepared to see. You notice what confirms your position and overlook what challenges it. This selective attention is not deliberate, it is automatic. And because it is automatic, it is rarely questioned. Behavior also plays a critical role in reinforcement. Your actions begin to align with your internal narrative, and these actions produce outcomes that further support your beliefs. If you believe you are justified, you act accordingly. And when others respond to your actions, their responses, whether supportive or resistant, are interpreted in ways that reinforce your original stance. Even opposition can be used as confirmation. If someone disagrees, it is seen not as a potential correction, but as evidence that they are mistaken, biased, or uninformed. In this way, the system becomes insulated. It does not break under pressure, it adapts to incorporate that pressure as further validation. This is the hallmark of a closed system. External input no longer serves as a source of information, it becomes material for reinforcement. Everything is filtered, shaped, and integrated in a way that preserves the structure. The possibility of genuine correction diminishes, not because it is absent, but because it is systematically excluded. Environment amplifies this effect. You begin, often unconsciously, to shape your surroundings in ways that support your internal framework. You gravitate toward people who share your views. You engage with sources of information that confirm your beliefs. You avoid situations that might challenge your perspective. This creates consistency, but not accuracy. Within such an environment, your beliefs are rarely tested. They are echoed, repeated, and strengthened. The absence of contradiction creates the illusion of certainty. You feel increasingly confident, not because your understanding has deepened, but because it has been continuously affirmed. The structure is now fully operational. At this stage, self-deception is no longer experienced as distortion. It feels like clarity, like conviction, like truth. The original moments of avoidance and rationalization are no longer visible. What remains is a coherent, stable worldview that appears internally consistent. But this consistency is maintained at a cost. The system requires constant reinforcement to remain intact. It depends on selective perception, controlled environments, and repeated justification. Without these, cracks begin to appear. Doubt emerges. Inconsistencies surface. And with them, the possibility of awareness returns. This is why disruption is often the beginning of change. When the reinforcing patterns are interrupted, when you encounter perspectives that cannot be easily dismissed, or experiences that do not fit your narrative, the system is forced to respond. It may attempt to strengthen itself further, or it may begin to weaken. The outcome depends on your response. If you react defensively, the system adapts and becomes more rigid. But if you pause, if you allow the disruption to remain without immediate resolution, you create a space in which examination becomes possible. This space is fragile, but significant. It is the first opening in a structure that has long been sealed. Through it, you can begin to observe the patterns that sustain your beliefs. You can see how repetition has replaced examination, how confirmation has replaced inquiry. And in seeing this, you regain a measure of control. Reinforcement is powerful because it is continuous. But it is not unbreakable. It depends on your participation. Each time you choose to question rather than confirm, to observe rather than assume, you interrupt the cycle. These interruptions may seem small, but they accumulate. And as they do, the system begins to lose its coherence. What once felt certain becomes uncertain. What once felt fixed becomes flexible. This is not a collapse, it is an opening. The structure of self-deception cannot sustain itself without reinforcement. And when reinforcement weakens, the possibility of seeing clearly, without distortion, without defense, begins to emerge once again. Collapse or clarity, the moment of confrontation, 600 words. Every structure built on distortion carries within it an unavoidable tension. No matter how refined, how reinforced, or how deeply internalized, self-deception cannot fully eliminate contact with reality. It can obscure it, reinterpret it, delay it, but it cannot erase it. Eventually, there comes a moment of confrontation. This moment is not always dramatic. It does not always arrive as a crisis. More often, it appears as a quiet inconsistency, something that does not fit, something that resists explanation. a result that contradicts expectation, a pattern that can no longer be ignored. At first, the system responds as it always has, by attempting to absorb the disturbance. You reinterpret the event. You search for explanations that preserve your existing framework. You adjust the narrative slightly, just enough to maintain coherence. In many cases, this is sufficient. The structure adapts, and stability is restored. But not always. There are moments when the inconsistency is too clear, too persistent, or too significant to be easily dismissed. The usual mechanisms, avoidance, rationalization, identification, reinforcement, begin to strain under the weight of contradiction. This is the threshold. You are faced, once again, with a choice. But unlike earlier stages, this choice is no longer subtle. It is direct, unmistakable. You can feel it in the tension between what you have been maintaining and what is now becoming visible. To continue the deception requires greater effort. You must ignore more evidence, construct more complex justifications, reinforce more aggressively. The system can still be preserved, but at an increasing cost. It becomes rigid, defensive, and fragile. Small disturbances trigger disproportionate reactions. The effort to maintain certainty begins to outweigh the comfort it once provided. Alternatively, you can allow the structure to weaken. This does not mean immediate clarity. It does not mean instant understanding. It means something far simpler, and far more difficult, the willingness to not resolve the contradiction immediately. To remain with it. To observe the inconsistency without rushing to explain it away. To acknowledge that your current framework may be insufficient. This is the beginning of collapse, not as destruction, but as disassembly. What collapses is not the self, but the structure built around it. As this process unfolds, layers begin to loosen. Justifications that once felt solid reveal their gaps. Assumptions that once felt certain begin to shift. The narrative that held everything together starts to lose its coherence. This can feel disorienting. Certainty fades. Confidence wavers. The stability you once relied on is no longer fixed. But within this instability, something essential re-emerges: direct perception. Without the constant need to defend, reinterpret, or reinforce, you begin to see more clearly. Not perfectly, not completely, but more honestly. You notice details that were previously filtered out. You recognize patterns that were previously ignored. Reality, no longer shaped to fit your expectations, begins to present itself as it is. This is clarity, not as a final state, but as an ongoing process. It requires continued attention. The tendency toward self-deception does not disappear, it remains present, ready to rebuild if left unexamined. But now, you are no longer operating within a closed system. You are aware of the mechanisms. You can recognize the early signs, the avoidance, the rationalization, the subtle shifts. And with that recognition comes choice. You can engage with discomfort rather than escape it. You can question your explanations rather than accept them. You can hold your beliefs lightly, allowing them to adjust in response to new information. This is not a state of constant doubt, it is a state of active alignment. You are no longer seeking certainty through preservation, but understanding through examination. The goal is no longer to protect an identity, but to refine perception. The moment of confrontation, then, is not an endpoint. It is a transition. From automatic distortion to conscious awareness. From rigid structure to flexible understanding. From self-deception to the possibility, never guaranteed, always requiring effort, of seeing clearly. And in that possibility, the entire structure, once so convincing, reveals itself for what it was, not truth, but a construction. The structure of self-deception is not imposed upon you, it is built by you, gradually, through repeated choices to avoid, justify, identify, and reinforce. Each layer serves a purpose: to protect, to stabilize, to preserve a sense of self that feels coherent and secure. But in doing so, it distances you from what is real. To see this structure clearly is not an act of judgment, but of responsibility. You begin to understand that distortion is not accidental. It follows patterns. It responds to discomfort. It strengthens through repetition. And most importantly, it depends on your continued participation. This realization does not demand perfection. It demands awareness. You will still feel the pull to avoid, to rationalize, to defend. These tendencies do not disappear. But they no longer operate unseen. You can recognize them as they arise, and in that recognition, you gain the ability to choose differently. Clarity is not something you arrive at once and keep. It is something you practice. Moment by moment, decision by decision, you either move toward alignment with reality or away from it. The structure of self-deception may always be possible, but so is its dismantling. And that possibility remains, as long as you are willing to see.